Ladies and gentlemen, dear participants of the conference War Next to Us, thank you very much for taking part in this event, although it is organized on a Saturday afternoon. But I think that for most of us, time stopped on the 24th of February. In the present situation, it is very difficult to think about something else than the war in Ukraine, at least in Poland. In our country, the war is really next to us. My personal impression is that I live in a parallel reality and I have no idea what has been recently going on around me. The only thing I know is what is really going on in Ukraine. I would like to thank for the invitation to this lecture. My special thanks are directed to the International Cognitive and Behavioral Psychotherapist Society and especially to Zafer Bekir, who gave me the possibility to give this lecture today. Today, I have the honor to deliver a lecture on, in my opinion, one of the most important topics, which is the healthcare of Ukrainian refugees during the ongoing war. The topic itself is very important, but we need to remember that the pandemic is still with us, so this lecture is prepared in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. However, I will also mention other very important health issues which gain importance as the war in Ukraine comes to an end. Before I begin, let me introduce myself just to give you an overview why I am here with you today. I'm the head of the Department of Education and Research in Health Sciences at the Faculty of Health Sciences of the Medical University of Warsaw since 2013. I have had an honor to hold first the position of the Vice Dean of the Public Health Division and then the position of the Dean of this faculty. And what is really important in the context of our today's meeting is my area of expertise, which is public health. As Vice Dean of the Department of Public Health, I have modified the curriculum for public health students to include migration and its importance for public health in Europe. The course Modern Migrations in the Context of Public Health is now offered as an elective course. Currently, I am a tutor for one of our Ukrainian students. Tutoring is organized within the Didactics Master's program, which is offered at the Medical University of Warsaw. I have visited Ukraine twice. I have visited 3 Ukrainian universities, and we discussed the possibility of cooperation. Here you can see the photo from Lviv with our Ukrainian friends. We were there in November 2018. What is the agenda for today? As we still have Russian tanks in Ukraine, but not only tanks, of course, the situation is still unresolved, dynamic, and unstable. But I would like to focus on 3 main points, which are Poland and Ukraine's coexistence, but before this ongoing war, at what point we are now as neighboring countries, what are the up-to-date public health challenges for Poland in the context of the war in Ukraine and the humanitarian crisis. The only one thing we now know for sure is that Poland is a witness, an observer, and to some extent the participant of the biggest migration crisis in Europe since World War II. The rest of the information I will tell you today will be based on estimation only. As the war goes on, we are not able to count anything in detail. We can only estimate and make an educated guess. Today, nothing can be predicted for sure, and this will be my key point today, estimation and probability. Let's look at the numbers. The total number of the refugees from Ukraine all over the world now is 3,300,000. Which countries are Ukrainians fleeing to? According to the United Nations Refugee Agency, they are fleeing to Poland, Italy, Romania, Moldova, Spain. But it is just a question of time when they reach every European country. This is highly probable because starting from the 24th of February, when Ukrainian citizens enter the territory of Poland, they can travel with no limits for 18 months, similar to European citizens within the Schengen area. According to the data of the United Nations Refugee Agency, the biggest number of Ukrainian refugees is, of course, in Poland now. The number of refugees is now estimated at 2 million or above. The future is completely unknown. In the context of migration, we must know that first and foremost, there is a huge internal migration in Ukraine now. People are migrating to the western part of Ukraine because this part of the country is still considered as a safe, or let's say safer place to stay. The United Nations Refugee Agency has estimated that the number of Ukrainians who were made to abandon their homes is 10 million people. It is a quarter of the Ukrainian population. Most of them now are staying in the western Ukrainian cities, such as Lviv or Lutsk. The population of Lviv has increased by a third. What is still worrying is the nearest future is still impossible to predict. But if the worst-case scenario comes true and the military forces enter the west part of the Ukrainian territory from Belarus, and many of these people will come to Poland and the final number of refugees will increase again. We don't know by how much. Please let me remind you that before the war, the number of Ukrainian refugees in Poland was estimated at more than 1,300,000, and it has been systematically growing after the crisis in Donbas in 2014. Most of them are officially working in Poland. Moreover, they are a very important part of Polish economy. Some of the industries, for example, the construction industry, may have a big problem without Ukrainian workers. Actually, this is happening just now because the men who used to work at construction sites were drawn to the army in Ukraine and many Polish investments stopped, even in our university. What is interesting from the historical perspective, it is that before the Second World War, the Polish society was the most ethnically diverse society in Europe. 1/3 of the population living in Poland was not Polish. And imagine that 19% of the population was Ukrainian and only 10% was Jewish. The situation completely changed during the time of communism, and now we are ethnically homogeneous with 98% of people of Polish origin. In comparison, in the European Union countries, the mean number of migrants in population is 15%. As I mentioned at the beginning, the number of migrants from Ukraine in Poland is still changing. At that moment, a decline in the number of people migrating to Poland has been observed for several days. There are several factors that can influence this situation. Lack of adaptation, conviction that the war is about to end, conviction that it is safe in Western Ukraine. President Zelensky's appeals can also be of importance. President Zelensky continues to call for a return home and support of the Ukrainian economy, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic. Moreover, it is worth adding that due to general military mobilization in Ukraine, more than 130,000 may have already left Poland. However, you can also notice an increasing number of women with children who also want to return to their abandoned homes. This number is estimated at 260,000. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to emphasize once again that the current refugee crisis related to the war in Ukraine is unprecedented. Never in the history of Europe has there been such a crisis, both in terms of the number of refugees and the short time in which they have arrived in Poland. We need to remember that by the end of 2016, nearly 5 million refugees and migrants reached European shores, undertaking journeys from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and other countries torn apart by war and by persecution, but they have been migrating for a long time. Once again, let's look at the map of Ukraine. In the context of migration, we need to remember that we have already had two waves of migration. The first wave of refugees from Ukraine were people who left before the start of hostilities or just after its onset when the armed conflict was not so intense. They were people with friends or a family in Poland. They knew the addresses to which they were coming. Studies indicate that such people have higher social competences and a higher competence in coping with difficulties. This group of refugees required short-term assistance just before or just after arriving in Poland, usually in terms of language or logistics. Unlike the first wave, the second wave of refugees are people fleeing from cities that were bombarded, often in front of their eyes. People who often saw the death of their relatives or people whose own homes was bombarded. They are people not only hungry or cold, but almost with all, but most of all with critical symptoms of PTSD, anxiety, or depression. This group consists mainly of mothers with children and the elderly. These people have significantly lower social competences and the ability to cope with the problem. Very often, these people use only Russian language. It is also worth emphasizing that immigrants do not want to move from large cities to smaller cities, for example, near Warsaw. The reasons for this include the desire to return to Ukraine in the event of a quick end to the armed conflict and greater opportunities to find work in large urban agglomerations in the event of a long-term armed conflict. The problem of the relocation of migrants to smaller towns is a real logistical challenge, especially since migrants themselves make decisions about their future life, and there are no mechanisms of forced resettlement to other places in Poland. Let's look at Warsaw, the capital city of Poland. The number of refugees who have passed through Warsaw is estimated by the mayor of Warsaw at 430,000. 300,000 refugees probably want to stay in Warsaw. Before the outbreak of the war, the population of Ukrainian citizens in Warsaw amounted to approximately 100,000 people. So, what are the biggest public health challenges in Poland now, in the context of the war in Ukraine? Ladies and gentlemen, if we are talking about the most important challenges to public health, we must begin with the law in Poland, especially medical law concerning the functioning of hospitals and primary health care. On March the 12th, the Act on Aid to Ukrainian Citizens in connection with an armed conflict in the territory of Ukraine was adopted in Poland. This document is supposed to, among other things, regulate issues related to the legal status of Ukrainian refugees in Poland. Thanks to it, refugees from Ukraine will be entitled to medical care on the terms and to the extent that is covered by compulsory or voluntary health insurance in Poland. The registration process of Ukrainians started a few days after the legal act was passed. Only in Warsaw, at least 300,000 of ID cards will be needed. In the photo, you can see the queue to the registration point when you can get a special identification number and certificate. This registration point is located at the National Stadium, which was used for a temporary hospital for patients infected with COVID-19 a few weeks ago. At this moment, children, young women, and the elderly go to Poland. Children should be screened for the implementation of the vaccination schedule. To do this, their parents need to be interviewed whether their children has been vaccinated or has any vaccination records. Let's look at urgent public health challenges in Poland now. The population of Ukraine is one of the least vaccinated populations in Europe. The priority actions in the implementation of the current most important health needs of migrants fleeing the war from Ukraine include vaccination against measles, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, and polio, hepatitis B, and COVID-19. In Ukraine, compulsory vaccinations concern 10 diseases: whooping cough, diphtheria, tetanus, measles, mumps, rubella, polio, tuberculosis, and hepatitis B. However, for several years, starting from 2014, fewer and fewer children are vaccinated against these diseases. The problem is the growing popularity of anti-vaccination movements supported by pro-Russian propaganda. According to the data of the National Institute of Public Health in Poland, the number and percentage of vaccinated children in Ukraine varies depending on the age group and the region of the country. The percentage of vaccinated children ranges from approximately 60% up to 99%. According to WHO data, in 2020 in Ukraine, vaccination against measles was 80%, against polio 84%, against whooping cough 81%, and against hepatitis B 80%. To be safe, we should achieve 90% vaccination rate, so we still miss 10% on average. As mentioned previously, according to WHO data, in 2020, measles vaccination in Ukraine was 81%. A very significant increase of the number of measles infections began in 2017. We could observe a 47-fold increase in infection compared to the previous year. In 2019, the number of detected measles cases exceeded 57,000. It is a glaring result of the decline in childhood immunization coverage. In the first decade of the 2000s, vaccination coverage with the first and second dose of MMR vaccine fluctuated in Ukraine at the level of 94 to 99%. In the second decade, it dropped by several dozen percent. In 2016, only 43% of children were given first dose, and, what is a very dangerous situation, only 37% got the second dose of the vaccination against measles. As in the case of measles, the vaccination coverage of children against whooping cough in Ukraine is also insufficient. Vaccination against whooping cough is carried out in Ukraine by administering the DTP vaccine. In 2015 to 2017, the most Ukrainian children did not receive a third dose of this vaccine. The risk of whooping cough is important, as there are still many cases of whooping cough in Europe. Let us remember that Europe has still not achieved the incidence rate below 1 per 100,000, which was assumed as a 2000 target. 22 years have passed and the target has not been achieved. Let's look at polio. Children from Ukraine are susceptible to poliovirus, unfortunately, due to the low immunization. Fortunately, this virus is endemic in Pakistan and Afghanistan, but if important, it could find fertile ground. It is worth noting that vaccination coverage with the third dose of polio vaccine received by children aged 6 to 18 months has fallen in Ukraine from 91% in 2008 to 51% in 2015. In the following years, the situation improved, but still required a lot of promotional and educational activities. In the last quarter of 2021, 20 cases of polio were reported in Ukraine, including one with paralysis of lower limbs. Another such traumatic event took place earlier this year, 2022. Let's remember that Ukraine also has a problem with HIV. Over 250,000 of Ukrainians are sick, of which 150,000 are actively treated. They are usually men over 40. Before I discuss the situation related to COVID-19 infections in Ukraine, I will present you the current situation in Poland. On Wednesday, March 23rd, over 10,000 new cases of SARS-CoV-2 infections were recorded. 1,088 of them are reinfections. 124 people died due to COVID-19. To date, more than 5 million cases of SARS-CoV-2 infections have been reported in Ukraine. 112,000 people have died from COVID-19. Only 36% of Ukrainians are fully vaccinated against COVID-19. The vaccination program against COVID-19 in Ukraine started later than in other European countries. The first vaccine was administered on February 24, 2021. The availability of doses was limited in the first months. One of the main reasons for the low level of vaccination was the anti-vaccination campaigns and the armed conflict in Ukraine since 2014. Disinformation actions were inspired by Russian influence, and especially in the areas most threatened by conflict. Russian propaganda intensified anti-vaccination moods and also revolted against health protection institutions, even against medical personnel. A booster dose of vaccination against COVID-19 was taken by 1.7% of the population. In Ukraine, 6 vaccines against COVID-19 have been approved for use. On the other hand, the Russian vaccine Sputnik V was not approved for use. The reason was the fear that the appearance of this preparation in the Ukrainian market would further worsen the willingness to vaccinate. The Polish Society of Public Health has developed a special information leaflet in Ukrainian on the benefits of vaccination against COVID-19 and the safety of this vaccine. A special protocol for people vaccinated against COVID-19 with a vaccine not authorized in the European Union has also been developed. So, what is the Polish public health policy towards Ukrainian refugees? First and foremost, children who plan to stay in Poland for more than 3 months will be subject to compulsory vaccinations in accordance with the schedule of vaccinations in Poland. If there is no medical documentation, they will be treated as unvaccinated children. For children over 5 years, between 5 and 12 years, and adults, COVID-19 vaccination is highly recommended. Currently, in Poland, attention is paid to exposure to various types of infections, in particular in the group of people working or staying with refugees on a daily basis. Volunteers, people hosting Ukrainians, people working in assistance centers. These people should be vaccinated and receive a booster dose of diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis vaccine, polio and MMR vaccine against rubella, measles and mumps if they have not been vaccinated with 2 doses. Vaccination against hepatitis A may be still considered. Ladies and gentlemen, participants of the War Next to Us conference, I hope that in this short speech I have managed to summarize the current health challenges in Poland related to the influx of such a large number of migrants in such a short time. Please note, over 2 million refugees from Ukraine came to Poland within 4 weeks. As a society, we are aware that that is just the beginning of a long road. We started very well, but will we meet the challenge? Time will tell. Thank you very much for your attention.